My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and this is the second in my series on the concepts of fall, mortality, and machine in Tolkien's works. In the last video, I talked about the fall and the various types of falls that we see in Tolkien's stories and how that falls out, pun intended, in various different ways. And one of the things that you could notice from that discussion is that falls inevitably have pretty drastic negative consequences, and they also can be reversed in some limited sense by the redemption of the person who does the falling. Boromir redeems his own fall. Frodo, in a sense, redeems his in advance by showing pity on Gollum. But you can also just fall without any kind of redemption at all and have just nothing but bad consequences. One of the bad consequences that comes from some of the first falls are, various kinds and issues related to mortality. And that, of course, is going to be the subject of this video. Mortality in and of itself seems like a rather mundane topic because it's just kind of a fact of life. In Tolkien's world, however, mortality is kind of a interesting topic for the simple reason that there are some beings who are not mortal and some who are. Although even the ones that are technically not mortal can still be killed, they never really die permanently because, as we know, the elves go back to Mondos and then are eventually, hopefully, if they haven't been really, really bad characters, rehoused in a new body and then carry on with their existence. Although Tolkien might even quibble with this because Tolkien would say that technically elves are only, longeval. They have a extremely long lifespan, which is equal to the lifespan of Arda itself. And beyond that, they may not exist anymore. Although, depending on which, level of, which stage of his writing you're looking at, that may change because there are some indications that elves will, in fact, survive the end of the world. But the key issues here are we're going to be looking at, the mortality of men specifically, how that plays out in a lot of different instances, the specific kinds of limited mortality that elves have, and also where those kinds of things lead even further into the future. So, starting with elves, because this will be a relatively quick one, as I mentioned, elves are not strictly speaking mortal in the sense that they die because their bodies can be killed, but they live on and then potentially get a new body and keep going. Nevertheless, death is a thing that can happen to them in some sense, and this is, again, mostly the result of Melkor's original fall, because his fall results in the marring of Arda, which results in the screwing up of Eru Ilúvatar's plan, which is that elves aren't really supposed to die at all. The first death of elves is Miriel, and this, of course, is kind of a hard one to explain in any scenario, and the Valar are pretty concerned about it, let's say, because they recognize the significance that this has. And Miriel's death, which is a willing death, which is contrary to the whole plan for elves, has its own significant problems that comes about later. And this is kind of a flip side reverse of Aragorn and the other good kings of Numenor and Gondor and Arnor, their willing acceptance of the death that they are supposed to have. Miriel willingly grabs a death that she shouldn't have. So she is wrong in doing essentially the same thing as Aragorn and others because her destiny is not really supposed to be that way. And similarly, we could see a kind of the, not flip side reverse, but close to, with Feanor, who doesn't accept death, but when he dies also doesn't really accept the fact that this was clearly kind of a just result of his own massive pride and foolishness. Instead, he joins his sons to just continue on with that same pride and foolishness, using his death as sort of like a second sealing of their oath, almost. So on the one hand, you have elves who can kind of take death onto themselves when they shouldn't. And then you have elves who can be killed, which is not really the way they're supposed to die. And then, that's not necessarily their own fault, but nevertheless, not really take it in the right way. We're going to see the same kinds of ideas in men, but again, flip side and reversed and all that. But with elves, it's also interesting because of their immortality, they have very different ways of looking at things. One of the things that Tolkien says, and I forget exactly where he says this, it's been a long time since I read it, but he makes the point that the immortality of elves gives them no real impetus to achieve in their own lifetimes. They have all the time in the world, quite literally. And as a result, they don't feel rushed to do much of anything, which is part of the reason why in the Silmarillion, Fingolfin and the other characters who have this idea of we should really actually attack Morgoth now while he's on the back foot and try to do something, never come to anything, because all the elves are like, yeah, we can wait it out, it's fine. And then of course inevitably Morgoth takes advantage of the fact that they are waiting it out and rebuilds his own forces, invents dragons and all kinds of other nasty things, and eventually almost wipes them all out before the Valar intervene. On the flip side, men who are naturally mortal and short-lived have this impetus to actually get things done. And we see this fairly explicitly in Hurin and Huor when they are rescued by eagles and taken to Gondolin. Turgon will tell them, you're not really supposed to leave here, guys. Nobody can leave once they're here. And they say, no, we don't even know how we got here. And by the way, it's fine for you all to just sit here in Gondolin and do nothing for years, but we're going to die in 60 years, and there's nothing you can do about that. So we want to go and achieve things, and we can't do that if we're just waiting around for the next shoe to drop. Now, as it happens, the next shoe actually drops, well within their own lifetimes. But the point is, they are expressing this aspect of the mortality of men that elves don't share in. And so elves constantly are in this kind of position of sitting back doing not much. There are a few exceptions to this, because there is, the Battle of the Last Alliance, you have things like that. But as Elrond says in the Council of Elrond, too often the elves have just chosen to leave Middle-earth and do nothing. It's like, well, we'll just go where we can live forever and be perfectly happy, instead of trying to achieve something here to end the threat. And this is, a repeated theme. Men, with the opposite problem, having, the potential to die within, very early, but also the certainty of death within roughly 100 years at most, end up with a lot of things that they want to do that they can't do. And for this reason, many of them become overly ambitious. You might say that this was a problem that Feanor had, although for him it wasn't really related to the fact that he was going to die. But you do see this kind of problem with people like Aldarion, who tries to achieve so much in his own lifetime that he completely neglects his own family, and as a result his wife turns against him, and the next thing you know, the Númenórean royal line is kind of screwed up. So you have those kinds of problems. But men also have the advantage of, we've got a certain amount of time in which we can do things, and so if we're going to do them, we got to do them now. We've only got, maybe 40, 50 years of really good health, and then, as adults, you're not going off to war if you're a 5-year-old. But, once you hit, roughly adulthood, you've got maybe 40, 50 years before you're not really going to be capable of doing any great deeds, and then, you're kind of done, and then not too long after that, you're not even here anymore, so you've got, that problem. And this results in a lot of different kinds of reactions to death, and this is where I'm going to spend a lot of my time in this video. Mortality creates a lot of different reactions, and you can see those kinds of reactions kind of in a, like the reverse side of how some of the elves take it, but also even between different humans, mortals, how they react to their own deaths compared to each other gets really interesting too. So to look at the opposites of Miriel and Feanor, for instance, Feanor doesn't die because of his own choice or, anything like that, but he does kind of reject the lesson of it. You have the flip side and the flip side reverse of that, which are people like, Denethor doesn't die by his own choice, but he does actually accept what happens, and he doesn't get bitter about it. I mean, he knows that he's probably going to his death the whole time, but he's not seeking it out. Eowyn, on the other hand, is seeking out death because she doesn't see any value in living anymore, and then when she's robbed of death on the battlefield, she is kind of bitter about that for a while until Faramir changes her mind. And then you've got people like Aragorn and the other kings of Gondor and Numenor and Arnor, who, because of their special, role in the world, they have this sort of gift, in a way, of whenever they've reached kind of the end of their natural lifespan, they can either choose to let it happen, basically, or they can, as many of the later kings of Numenor did, choose to reject that and hold on to the bitter end, becoming witless and unmanned, as it puts it in several different places in Tolkien's works. Becoming dotard and losing their minds and all this other stuff. And of course we see Ar-Pharazôn, who is kind of like the poster child for all of this, egged on by Sauron. He of course wants to achieve immortality, and as a result, he hangs on past what his normal time of death probably would have been, and as he feels that it's really about to come, he starts getting really desperate. And, up to that point, Sauron had kind of been working on him, trying to get him to make the decision to invade Valinor, and Pharazôn was like, I'm still not ready for that move. But then when he finally gets to the point where he feels death approaching, and, he knows he's not going to be able to hold on forever, he's like, okay, I'm just going to have to bite the bullet and do it, because otherwise I'm going to die, and I don't want to die. And so he goes so far against death that he is going to, invade Valinor, attack the Valar themselves, and try to take immortality for himself, which is clearly the wrong thing to do, because A, he couldn't achieve immortality even if he did, but B, even if he could achieve immortality, that's not the way to go about it, quite obviously, because the Valar are not the bad guys, and they're not withholding anything from you. So there's that kind of reaction too. Another kind of reaction to death, and this is, really like in some ways the worst, is to deliberately seek out death in the way that Miriel did, but not for the same kind of reasons. And we see this in, personified in Denethor. Denethor attempts to take not only his own life, but Faramir's. It's not 100% clear if he recognizes that Faramir is still alive. He may realize it, but think he's on his deathbed anyway and impossible to save. Who knows what's going through Denethor's mind at that stage of madness, but the point here is Denethor's reaction to death is, well, living is going to be really terrible, so I might as well just take my own life. And taking your own life is really never the good option. It's just not a good one. Ever. For elf, for man, for anybody. You're never supposed to do that. Tolkien, good Catholic against suicide. There's not a single case of suicide in any of his stories that is really, yeah, that was the right decision. The closest you could come to is Turin's, but Turin's decision to end his own life only seems like a good decision because it finally gets us out of our misery. Let's face it. Turin's choice to commit suicide is really just the last despairing choice of a man who has long made so many bad decisions that he has kind of painted himself into a corner of, I have to undo and rethink my entire life, or I'm just going to have to end it. And he's not willing to face the hard work of, the others, so he just takes his own life. Now, there are times when it is perfectly viable to be willing to, if not deliberately take your own life, at least to put your own life on the line. And we see this in the case of Frodo specifically, because Frodo, for a fairly long time before he even gets into Mordor itself, is under the assumption that if he ever makes it, he's not going to make it back. He's either going to die there as a result of whatever cataclysm results from throwing the ring into Mount Doom, or, there's just not going to be a way back out that they can survive. Sam is kind of the opposite side to Frodo for a long time, because Sam is, in a weird way, both hopelessly pessimistic and also ridiculously optimistic. Sam never saw any hope in the whole thing, but also he's constantly thinking about making sure there's enough food for the return journey. So, he's kind of got this weird northern courage thing going on, which is combined with a sort of idea that, I'm always going to be planning for the best possible result, even though he assumes that's not what's going to happen. So Sam is kind of weird. Sam ultimately, of course, does come around to the point of, yeah, we're going to starve. We're not going to make it. There's just not enough. And if we make it to Mount Doom, it'll be lucky. Because they're running out of energy. They're running out of, the will to move on. They're running out of everything. And it's just, So Sam eventually hits that point, but he doesn't start there. He starts with, this mission is doomed, but also I'm going to plan for us to make it all the way back out of Mordor by trying to save enough food for a return trip. It's kind of a weird cognitive dissonance he's got going on there. But Frodo, for the longest time, sees his mission as one that is fated to end in his death, because he just doesn't see any way around it. But that's fine, because Frodo is not taking his own life. He's just doing what he can to achieve what he knows must be done, and if that brings about his death, so be it. Theoden is kind of in the same position. I already talked about him in contrast with Denethor, but Theoden is going in knowing he's probably going to die, because, let's face it, the man is over 70 years old, and he's going into a battle which is almost unwinnable. There's almost no way to win it, as far as he knows, based on the information he has. But he knows that this battle has to be fought. And again, it's kind of the northern courage thing. It's the idea that I am going to fight the battle, even though I am almost certain to lose it, and that will cost me my life, but that's fine. So we shouldn't hold our lives so dear that we end up like an Ar-Pharazôn, but we also shouldn't treat them as something that is not sacred, like Muriel and Éowyn. Éowyn doesn't think of her life as worth living, so she's going to throw it away. Muriel is like, I'm too tired to go on, I just don't care anymore. On the flip side, you have Ar-Pharazôn, who's like, I'm going to hold on to every last ounce of life that I can get, and, you've got people like that. You have to treat life as sacred, that seems to be at least part of the message, but also, it's not something that you can just take more of. You have what you have. Just be glad you have it. So, mortality you can see in all these different facets of how people handle the concept of their own death, and how they look at the possibility of death, and how they treat, what that means for them personally. You can see a lot of different ways of looking at it. Is death a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it just a necessary thing which we have to accept? Is it something that we should seek out? Is it something that we should reject? Is it something that we should just accept when it comes? There's all these different dimensions to these different issues, and all of this stuff stems, like I said, from some of those original falls. Melkor's fall brings the possibility of death into the world. The fall of man seemingly brings in the mortality of man, depending on which version of, their origins you believe. Is it Adonel, or is it, what the elves believe from the Silmarillion? Not sure. But the point is, death is a thing in this world, and you have to accept it to some extent. That doesn't mean you should go out and seek it. So, this is a lot of what goes on with mortality. But a lot of the problem with mortality is the rejection of it. And there's so many things that people do to try to get around that. And this is where the machine comes in. Because you can react, like Ar-Pharazôn does, and try to just take immortality because you think you can from the immortal lands, the Undying Lands. Or you could attempt to achieve it by the use of machine. magic, technology, call it what you will, but that will be the subject of the final video in this series. Because, of course, that is a lot of what Tolkien's machines end up doing. That's not entirely the sole focus of machinery and magic in Tolkien's world, of course, but it will be a big part of it, and it's intimately connected with the problem of mortality, even if it's not directly trying to solve that problem. So, in the final video in this series, we'll be looking at the machine. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it around for others who would be interested in this topic. Make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're watching to catch my future content, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter to catch Tolkien-related trivia questions every week, and check out the description below for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Ringbearer Grubermo and elf friends Nathan Dufour and Robert Kindling.